Thank you so much for coming back promptly after lunch, and I really hope you enjoyed looking around. No, it's fine. Looking around the installations and are feeling very inspired by those and by the conversations this morning. So obviously we heard a huge amount this morning, from the growing of cotton and flax, through the processing, the making of clothing, through to the consumption and the kind of over-consumption and waste produced by fashion and textiles. So we've gone across the globe and also across the whole supply chain of fashion. What we're going to try and focus on this afternoon is really how do we turn some of those insights that we've heard this morning into action? What is it that we need to do? How can we really be changing this industry? And how can the people in this room play an even greater role than they are already playing in shaping that? So we really encourage you to get involved in the conversation. The way it's going to work is, obviously we have the microphones up here. So we'll start a conversation. Sunny is going to start us off as a kind of prompt for the conversation. No pressure. And then I'll invite people to join in the conversation. If there's something if you want to add a contribution, please can you raise your hand? Obviously, because there's a lot of people in the room, you need to think about how we kind of bring different people in. So please raise your hand and I'll bring you into that conversation. We're going to start off thinking really about the growing of materials, starting from that piece, and then over the hour and a half that we have, we can then bring in and move into different areas of the conversation. But we've seen so much that's kind of already happening, but what can we really do now to focus on action and intention and shift this industry? What are the things that we need to be doing, and how can we do that? Is there anything you wanted to add at the beginning, Laurie?
Something I took from this morning was something that Kwame said was about intention. And so I think for me that's the big buzzword for this afternoon. We've got less than a couple of hours, and I'd really like to come away with an intention by 4 o'clock of what we're going to work to for 2025, that we set our intentions. Okay. Lovely.
Thank you so much. And also when you kind of make a contribution, if you could share your name and where you're from, just so that everyone in the room knows everyone else is here. Okay, I'm going to hand over to you, if that's okay, Sunny. I know this is a very impromptu conversation at lunch around thinking about what do we... You're regretting that now, aren't you? Starting from the kind of growing, what was the kind of question that kind of raised for you over lunch that we were talking about?
So I think when you're thinking about the future of textiles, I think for me the starting point is around what materials are we considering growing, and actually should we be considering growing any materials at all? And the reason for this is, if you look at a material like, and I ask this question as a provocation, with a full awareness and knowledge of the number of livelihoods that depend on these materials and processes. But if you look at a material like cotton, and just how resource intensive cotton is, there is a question around, okay, how much longer can we justify the resources that cotton takes up in its production? And are there any good alternatives that we should be exploring? In Kenya, there's a really interesting little company that set up a few years ago called Tosheka, who are focusing on growing cotton as well as eri silk. So eri silk, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but eri silk is another kind of silk where the other name for it is peace silk, I think. Yeah, peace silk. And the reason that it's called peace silk is, unlike mulberry silk, in eri silk, you don't have to harm the worm in extraction of the silk. So there's this really, really dry part of the country, in the eastern part of the country, where they're growing and farming these eri silkworms. And it's quite a successful model. The way that they've set up the model is they sell these sort of like worm silk kits to women across the eastern part. So you buy a kit, you get like a castor plant, you also get, I think, about 1,000 silkworms, and they show you how to set it up in your homestead. And they show you how to harvest the cocoons, and then they buy the cocoons back from you. And then they have a whole sort of like manufacturing process, and they make really cool stuff. And the model is really interesting because it allows for a lot of women in this community to have this added what is also interesting, and this is, I guess their silk is not so much piece silk, because they found an additional use for the worms, which is that as opposed to releasing these hundreds of worms into an ecosystem that they're not native to and possibly triggering some sort of like bizarre things, they dry out the worms and grind them into animal feed. And so as a model, I find it really fascinating because it considers many things. It benefits multiple players in the community and also in that ecosystem. And it's also giving Kenyan designers some new materials to explore. And we're seeing the same thing with sort of like banana fiber and pineapple fiber, as well as sisal. So yes, all of that to say, my starting question is, what materials should we be growing?
Great, thank you. Anyone want to come in on that? What materials should we be growing? Yeah, Rosie?
Yeah, I don't want to just leap in.
Go for it, go for it.
Okay. Hi, my name is Rosie. I'm here from Fantasy Fibre Mill, which is based up in Scotland. So we've been working on a project to grow flax, which there's some here on the table.
And this is from Blackburn.
Oh, amazing. Well, that's very exciting. And yeah, one of the reasons which we're excited to work with flax as a textile plant is because it is very easy to grow it organically. So you don't have to use a lot of fertilizer or pesticides. You can basically plant it and just leave it to its own devices. And yeah, especially compared to some types of like very intensive cotton farming, which uses a lot of pesticides, it's a good option. I mean, the other main reason is because we wanted something local to Scotland, and you definitely can't grow cotton in Scotland. It's completely the wrong climate. Yeah, I think that fits quite well into this idea of like regenerative textiles, because we were really looking at it from a point of view of how can it regenerate not only like the textile industry, but actually the soil itself. And it's a good crop to grow in a rotation, and sort of, yeah, try and like improve the soil biodiversity. So it has a lot of kind of like benefits on a soil level when it's grown organically and like in a crop rotation. And yeah, I think thinking of like different diverse sources of fiber is a really interesting starting point, and thinking about like what different fiber sources grow well in whatever part of the world you're in and work well in the local environment. Yeah, it's like really interesting.
Yeah, so it's thinking very much about what's right for the particular place.
Yeah.
Do you want to come in on that?
Can I just ask a question?
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, I'll introduce myself. I'm Rachel Kelly. I'm from Manchester School of Art. I'm on my day off. I'm just here for fun. How do you know about these fibres and growing? What's your background? Are you a farmer?
I've done some farming, yeah. So I did fashion and textiles as an MSc at Heriot Watt, which is in Scotland. But my main introduction to it was I used to work as a costume designer for like theatre and circus and that kind of thing. And then obviously over lockdown that was all cancelled. So I then was volunteering at a farm so I did a whole year of being a farmer. And I was kind of thinking about how those two things related to each other, I guess. And I got really fascinated by if it would be possible to grow my own clothes from scratch. And that led me down a whole rabbit hole of flax growing and processing.
Thank you. I think my question was kind of cheeky in a way. It's about education and who's involved in this system and opening textiles up into other systems of manufacture, agriculture, and areas that we don't teach in textile programmes. So that's just something I was wanting to consider. If I've got the authority, the qualification, and the lack of, if we don't know about this, it's an education point, how can things change? And it seems to me something's missing, maybe. I don't know if anyone else agrees.
Yeah, and I wonder actually, you didn't talk about, Rosie, but the kind of machinery that you're creating. So I think that's another part of education too, of like actually how do you know how to process the materials? So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that briefly.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, one of the main things I found out in my research of trying to grow clothes was that in the UK, we've got rid of all of our processing machinery pretty much. It's all been outsourced overseas for decades. And so that became the sort of bottleneck of, there was a lot of farmers who were keen to try it out as a new crop, and there was a lot of fashion designers or interior designers who were excited about the idea of using locally grown stuff, and there's no machinery. So we've been working on some open source machine designs as a sort of collaborating with different people, some the Berlin Textile Co-op, where Studio Hilo's based, designed like an open source spinning machine, and it's designed to be made of like 3D printed parts and things that are easy to buy off the shelf, so that anybody could build their own like spinning machine. And the initial design was for wool spinning, but we've changed that to, like, made the necessary changes so that it can spin a long staple fibre like flax, because flax is very long, as you can see. It's about this long, whereas wool's often quite short. So that's been the main kind of thing our project has focused on, is the machinery design. And it might seem like a bit of a reinventing the wheel kind of thing to do, to reinvent machinery that exists elsewhere in the world. But from all the research, we found that the industrial machinery that does still exist is incredibly expensive and incredibly huge. So it costs millions of pounds, and you'd have to be growing like minimum 1,000 hectares of flax to make it even vaguely worth owning some of this machinery. So we're trying to build stuff that's small scale, so that if you're just growing like a couple of fields or even one small field of flax, that it's worth having that, and that you can process stuff on a like smaller local scale.
Thank you. Do you want to come into that?
Rose Sinclair, I teach design at Goldsmiths, and I think one of the things about your question of education, I did my BSc in textiles many years ago, and when we were being taught textiles, we actually learnt how to spin our own fibre. So we learnt how to get the whatever the fibre was, spin our own yarn, then use it for weaving and knitting. But I think the nature of textiles courses have changed, so students actually just get the yarn. So they actually don't actually experience what a fibre is, how to blend it, how to make it, then how to use, whether it's suitable. We had to test our own yarn. We had to make sure it was suitable for whatever we wanted it to be used for. We then had to test the fabric. We then had to say, okay, this is the source where I got it from, this is where it came from. We knew the provenance. So sustainable thinking has been in my head since I did my undergrad degree, and it's then kind of embedded itself within my own research, talking about women's networks, talking about textiles, where they come from. And I think one of the threads that I've understood today is that there is a link between the kind of, I come from an Afro-Caribbean community, and there is a link, a distinct clear link for me, and I was talking with Lucille here, that there's a distinct clear link between the kind of the Afro-Caribbean kind of diaspora experience, as well as the kind of African continent experience in terms of textiles and sustainability, and how we're discussed within the kind of the textiles genre. So I think the education bit needs to be, how do we need to kind of re-look at the textiles education that we're already giving students, and should there be a concurrent teaching of, this is where textiles come from, this is how you might need to align the thinking about how you design fashion. So it's not just, here is some cloth, make the clothes. What is the cloth? Where does it come from? How is it woven? Where is its provenance? So it's the provenance of the yarn and the provenance of the cloth. need to be aligned together when we're actually teaching, not as two separate things. This is your lecture on sustainability, but there's no kind of alignment with the practice of the actual doing. They're seen as two kind of different things that are done. One's done in contextual studies and the other one's done in the studio, and there's no alignment with the practice and no alignment with the context. And I think that's where the disconnection lies. And until students see that, they don't get it. And we have this then other conflagration with, I'm going to buy the latest vintage fashion, but then that also gets discarded. So this notion that we have a disconnect, I think, within the kind of the differentiation between going to a jumble sale and buying stuff and then discarding it, going to a vintage fashion shop and then eventually discarding it, and then not seeing that is all part of the same chain of fashion stuff.
Yeah. I wonder if actually I could bring Tom in. Sorry, I'll come back to you, Lucille, next. But Tom in around the this sense of making and learning, and obviously the way you're working is sort of people learning to make, but outside of the kind of formal education space.
Yeah, definitely.
What have you been thinking around textiles and how that kind of education piece of making fits together?
Yeah, Tom from the making rooms next door, so if anyone wants to see a makerspace, just literally the building down the road. I mean, I love the idea of reinventing the wheel. I think that should be your tagline, because it's sort of saying, like, things that we take as completely designed and was like, well, we don't need to look at that. It's, that's done and dusted, and actually we need to sort of reevaluate. I think a lot of things that are already designed and see if we can design them better. I love the fact that we're seeing a Discord and a GitHub repo on the screen already in terms of sharing ideas. One of the things we're hoping to do is to make Fab Lab Blackburn make a Fab City. So there's this concept of the only things that should move between cities are ideas and people. Atoms should try and stay where they are, essentially, because it's a lot easier for someone to design something halfway across the world and then just sort of transmit that in ones and zeros and electrons, and then we can sort of reproduce those ideas halfway across the world, whether that be machines or whether it be programs of learning and training in different communities. So across the road we have 3D printers, laser cutters, and a nice mix of sort of technical and new equipment, and then traditional equipment like potter's wheels and screen printing and mold making. And it's lovely to see the sort of that it's a spectrum. It's not sort of old and new. It's a case of how can we use traditional technologies and new technologies and use new technologies to create traditional technologies and like you say, reinvent the wheel. And for that all to be sort of a learning process for everyone, so people can come to these places, have fun doing what they're doing, make something that they're really proud of, but sort of over the years actually learn really valuable skills, both traditional and sort of new digital skills as well.
What do you think is really needed to get that making happening more in these spaces? I
mean, certainly the sharing of ideas. So I've got an obsession. I love visiting these spaces, and so I've been to about sort of 40 or 50 make spaces, mostly across Europe, and seeing loads of these projects, and all too often they're sort of brilliant ideas and research that are being done, and just how can we connect all these spaces together to share those ideas. As soon as the files are available, I'll definitely be 3D printing one of the spinning wheels, because it makes sense that either we do that piece of work as a collaboration, or one group does it, and then let's replicate that. Let's sort of refine it, and we saw that sort of during the pandemic in terms of loads of groups coming together, and one group would sort of design something, another group would 3D print it, and then another group would sort of improve upon it, and then collectively we had great designs for all sorts of things, from face shields to sort of respirators and things like that. So that sort of coming together of ideas, and then just try and keep materials where they are.
Amazing, thank you. So far we've talked about the sense of fibres, what should we be growing, how do we connect to where we really are and what the right conditions are for a place, then how do people learn about that, how do they get the kind of right technology and the right information to help them sort of produce things. Lucille, did you want to come in on kind of reflecting on those?
Yeah, I did, sorry. Lucille Jonquier, I'm a textile artist. work with natural dyes, pigments, fibres. My work engages legacies of colonisation, slavery. I put the spotlight on a place that's connected to my own heritage and my colleagues here, Jamaica, one of Britain's most lucrative plantations. I think that we, in order to understand the present, we have to look back. I applied for a commission recently, and it was to tell the story of a similar cloth that you have next door, the Penistone cloth. But this cloth was woven in mid-Wales. It's called Welsh Plains, and I think most of it was actually woven in mid-Wales. I haven't really told the story. My intention is not to tell the story from the perspective of the weaver, you know, working class weavers, they hardly had a choice. I want to give a voice to the person who did not have agency, and that's the enslaved person. What I want to say in my making is that that cloth was complicit in loss and erasure of identity, and we're still doing that by sending our textile waste over to Africa. We are profoundly undermining the identity, the strong cultural identity that exists there, because we have no relationship to some of the things. I'm using the royal we here. I know it's different with this group, but you know, it doesn't seem that we don't have a relationship with our textiles. So I'll be using a fibre that I feel is underappreciated here, and it's wool. You know, Welsh farmers cannot sell their fleece. We don't want to buy the wool. This is something that's available to us. Why aren't we using it? And these skills that we have, so easy to learn, crochet, knitting. How many sweaters does a person really need? So the country can provide us with sweaters because we can get into the habit of repairing our stuff as well, the joy of repair, either an invisible repair or a repair that reflects our quirky identities. So there's wool. The reason why I feel that we have to look back to move forward is that it bothers me that Jamaica and other countries gave us some of the finest cotton in the world. And that's not an emotional comment. Your contribution here really resonated with me, because in places like Jamaica, Barbados, Americas, it's sea island cotton. It's luxurious because of the length of the fibre. It feels like silk, and that fibre is still being grown for export. The people in the country cannot access that fibre. Some of my research that I'm doing at the moment, I have this duality to my life, Jamaica and the UK, and I am concerned about making a contribution to Jamaica. So I'm researching pigments, dyes. I have no desire to replicate the capitalism of the past. So I think we have to look at alternative models, and if people think that that's eccentric, so be the case, because this model does not work. In this model where we send our raw materials come from one place, go to another place, and we have no relationship with that. How is that acceptable, this way of living? We have to kind of stop and pause. So it bothers me that this beautiful, luxurious cotton, Jamaicans can't access that cotton. It's grown for export. So these things are still continuing. As I move forward, I do want to make contributions to the UK, but I have to think about how I can bring Jamaica with me. We have plundered the resources from overseas. What are we going to do now? Think of the solutions in this country, and we abandon the places that we have benefited from and that we have profoundly undermined with our structure of capitalism, our economic development. What Sunny, you were saying about the policies, so Africa is forced to accept our waste. It's just, it's awful. And I think we need to feel sort of like deeply upset and hurt by that, and be more vocal about expressing and making our choices and just being loud about that. Maybe that's what I want to see for 2025.
Thank you, Lucille. And that brings to mind a bit of a conversation we had with Jeremy, who I can see now at lunchtime, around how do you kind of deal with that relationship with places that have been growing and making and developing programs, and how do you think about that kind of relationship in terms of when you're shifting and creating new ways of doing stuff? How do you not kind of completely sever ties with places?
Yes, so we were talking about the, I think it's 40 billion garments that we donate to charity every year. A good chunk, say 40 to 50% of those go straight to landfill, but 50% of those don't go to landfill. There are 30,000 people working in Cantamanto market, as you know much better than me. So there's an incredible amount of jobs and economic possibilities produced. So I suppose instead of like the wholesale calling for this sort of obliteration of what is possibly what is, an economy that runs on waste colonialism, but albeit at the same time sustains many people's lives, what is a way to sort of pivot, move this thing towards something that might offer more certainly dignity alongside many other things. I think I like to speak from the position of a Western, consumer and not for anyone else, but I think that my sort of megaphone cry would be to consider, to urge, say BTB23, like, to be urging consumers to what they put in these bins or bags or send that. The first thing is, if it's in good enough state to give to a friend, then that's a fine thing. If I would give this to Sunny because I think this has enough worth. If it's anything less than that, you've got to find another use for it. And people throw up their hands at that point in the sort of global north and like, well, what could I possibly do, with this thing, as if it was sort of unimaginable. Now you go almost anywhere in the global south and you find people reassigning value, meaning, function to things that might not have had that. So obviously in the industrial terms, things go into sort of stuffing sofas. Now, I happen to use old rags in my studio for painting. Not everyone's a painter. Not everyone makes monsters, in their studio. But however, we clean our houses. We people. What is sort of fascinating is how much the North has to learn from the South, and how that material imaginary that we here have been just like trained out of having any sort of practical sort of belief in our own ability to do stuff. What we know is to buy into trash, and we're very good at that. And there's almost nothing after or between those things. And so give things away, donate them if they are if they are of a quality that can then be resold. If not, find, and there are innumerable ways that we can use fabrics around the home for cleaning purposes, or, well, for us all to brainstorm, perhaps. That was one thing. I have lots of other caffeinated thoughts. That's probably enough.
Maybe let's come back to those, because I think that's a really good challenge around how are we making use of things, what is needed to help people to do that in a different way.
I would actually say, when you go to the shop, check your label before you even... That decision-making starts when you actually go to the shop. Mm-hmm. Check the label on your garment. What is it? Is it a mixed fibre? We know that you can't on mixed fibres, and the process of changing that, of disposing of a mixed fibre garment. And now lots of garments come with multiple mixed fibres. They're not just not just a polyester cotton blend anymore. They're acrylic. They're acrylic, polyester, nylon mixes, and so on. Check the fibre. Is it 100% cotton? Is it 100% wool? Is it 100%? Nothing is 100%. Hardly anything is 100%. And if it's 100%, it's a higher value garment. And we're in a cost of living crisis. People aren't buying those things. So check the label on your garment first. What can you do? So the education of yourself. What can you do with that product? If you're going to have to buy that product, what are you going to be able to do with it? It's going to go in the wash. What is it going to do to the environment when you put that in the wash? We also have to educate ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's coming back to fibres again, isn't it? We come back to that circle around what is in that. How do you know how to deal with it? I'm going to bring in Laurie, who's got her hand up.
I just think those questions, given that we've got the privilege of all these people who are doing that on a daily basis and showed us how to do it so inspirationally this morning, about how they recycle and upcycle the stuff that we're dumping on them. Maybe they can answer that question better than we can. Obviously, we can't answer the question because
we're not doing
won't
it.
be doing it.
I think that is good question. Like she just said, you have to check before to buy. And you have also to teach the new generation for creativity. You have to, that is why I was saying this morning, like, we have to bring something back. Because if you grow cotton, you know, I grow cotton, like I can have like 10 ton a year. But what I'm going to do with that if it's not sell this cotton to the government and then they will sell to Bangladesh and then it will come back to Benin like waste. It's to, you know, that does not make sense. But, you know, in the same time, we have to teach the new generation, like artists have to talk about, artists have to say, okay, like me, what I try to do is I grow cotton, but it's impact people in the area I grow my cotton, because if they pay €2 to the workers, I try to pay €3 or $2.50. But that is for me the politics to bring people to my cotton plantation, because I'm artist, I'm conceptual artist. So they're not going to work for me as like, you know, somebody who just grows cotton and then keep it, because I'm not allowed to keep the cotton I grow myself. But if I don't keep it and then I cannot use it, somebody going to use and make the thread, make another like a thread, send back to Africa, and the tailor will use to make cloth in Benin. But why we grow the cotton? So we just grow the cotton for our economy? No, we have also to think like, okay, now we can invite somebody from London who have big factory or who have a small factory to do workshop in Benin. But have artists, I cannot do that because I don't have this platform to do it. So I cannot also say we have to fight for the government to do this, because they change every 5 years or every 10 years. You have new team and they have a new policy to work about the cotton and to say. But only thing I think is the best way is you have to know what you wear. Mm-hmm. You have to know where the cotton is from, and you have to think about who is make this cotton before to buy. So that is, but also the important thing is like when you have like the fast fashion, and then you buy one T-shirt and then in next year you have to throw away. You are also responsible to contribute to these ways and other things. So why not buy one cloth and you can use for 5 years? So that's what I try to do. So we have the same system in Benin, when you have some cloth made by a royal family, you can use this for like 20 years. 20 years you can use this. I still have like cloth from my grandfather I can use today. But now we go to another thing, like we think this is bad, but the good is from Europe. So we have to teach our own people.
Yeah. I think for a lot of us, it's learning how to reuse that, how to value that and reuse it again. Did you want to come in on that?
I actually feel like there's no like direct answer to that. Reason being because like when you're on the ground in Zimbabwe, for example, like we actually have a debate amongst ourselves as people with regards to bales and their function within our society. So there's a discussion where the government actually wants to ban bales because for them, they believe that it's hindering our non-existent fashion industry, whereas other people are saying it's a whole economy within itself. People are relying on these bales for sustenance, for their livelihoods, and other people have an alternative perspective of how do we then begin to integrate bales into the fashion system? How do we begin to redefine fashion for us in 21st century Zimbabwean people who have this situation that is now really, honestly, out of hand. It's there, it's not gonna go anywhere overnight. So what is the solution that we as a people can come up with? I know previously there was an organization whose name I won't mention that I was working with, and we're like, you guys have the technologies. As Africa, we're falling behind. We're getting the dumping of all this stuff, but we can break it down to create new materials. Why not perhaps teach us, establish these infrastructures in this space where you want to dump all this stuff and allow us to still have jobs for our people, create new materials. Like, we're trying to come up with our own solutions, but it's not an option. It's not something that they want to like release control over. So I don't think the answer is black and white, and it's definitely not going to be black and white if the very people where the dumping is happening can't even agree amongst themselves as to what sort of a future they want for themselves within a fashion context. I think once the people within those spaces can agree on what do we want to see for ourselves, is this something that we want within our system, is something that we completely don't want, how is it going to function? Until we understand that for ourselves, we're not really going to see any tangible change because we're not in alignment with what we even want to teach our future kids, because we'll be teaching them something different completely. One will be like, let's grow cotton and teach our traditional skills. Another will be like, actually, let's deconstruct because we have this material here. So it's, yeah, the discussions are going to be long and hard because people can't even agree within their own spaces what the solution is. But I think it's just a lot of conversations.
Do you think it needs to be something that has to be totally aligned, or is there room for various different ways of doing it? And then I'm going to come to you and you.
They're going to be varied. But I feel like the only way you can see mass movement is when the masses agree. Until the masses agree, it's almost like really fragmented and people are functioning in silos and there's no real tangible change that you can see within a space. So yeah, I think it needs to have some form of a mass element to it.
My name is Van Lieberg. I'm a photographer, but I also work in other discipline. At the moment, I am drawn to fabric, and this is my sort of first public attempt at using fabric in anything. And I'm trying to look at torture and trauma, using fabric as a metaphor for the skin. And in the process, that's imperialism, colonialism, and slavery, enslavement of African people. And as part of the process, I too have been growing some flax, and it seems like flax is very popular at the moment. I've also been to workshops, and I've seen a lot of stuff on flax, and I really didn't go looking for it. It just seems to be appearing. I wasn't expecting, some flax to be here today, but here we are. But in response to this, now, the first few words just listening here, I wrote down was activism, politics, education, industry, business, economy, venture capitalism, and investment. Those are just some of the things that was going through my head as I hear. And we hear about what seems to be millions of tons. I'm sure I'm not exaggerating by saying that off the top of my head, that's been deposited in not just Africa, but many other countries. And I think to think how we might just repurpose garments, I think we need to look much more seriously. I think, that's not enough. One of the ideas I thought of in the process, I think everyone who's involved in the fashion industry should be made to spend some time in these countries where this material is kept. They should be made to help to clear up the mess before they start to build new ones. I think places like the lady on the end from the college, from the University of Manchester, I think perhaps you should start by doing something with your course. I worked with Newman University, and I know we used to take people a lot to the Gambia. So perhaps you can take some of your first-year students and let them live with the people amongst them, let them feel, let them see. But then I thought, well, what's that going to do? They might come back. But the people who are buying these clothes and they only buy them to be photographed once on Instagram or on TikTok, how are you going to get around that? So there's a massive education that's needed for all of this. And I think it's not just piecemeal. You have to have serious activism for this to happen. And just to sit here and talk about it, as I've witnessed over the years, a lot of these events, they just filter out, and then in the end, everything continues. So, if you're serious, we really need to get together to do something rather than just hot words.
Very true.
Or hot air.
I was really on the same vein as you, actually. So I'm Evie, I'm the director of Fast Slow, which I think some people are coming to tonight. It's a theatre show at the Cotton Exchange. But yeah, I think just hearing what everybody is saying, I think for me, because I was in Ghana with Kwamena in August, and I think it really just feels like there is too many clothes in the world. Like when you're there, when you're here, but if fashion is an expression or a reflection of our society, fashion is showing that our society is sick, with greed, because we're all just wanting more, never satisfied, producing more, taking more, wasting more, showing it once on Instagram. It's all this, our value systems, I think, have just got so about the image. And I think that's actually global, because everybody now is in this global world of just taking an image and saying, okay, look at me, and that's done. And I think the value systems when we were in Ghana, it was just felt so profoundly different, because in the market, kind of like what Jeremy's saying, first of all, everybody was so well dressed in Accra. It was because there's so many clothes, everyone's really well dressed, from literally everybody at every level of society is so well dressed because there's so many clothes. But then along the aisles of the market, there's a whole aisle. Every 5 aisles there's an aisle of people fixing, but not just fixing. There's people sewing on fringing, or just value and taking time with things, basically. And then our value systems here are completely about the image, and I feel we just need to stop, really. There's so much, there's too much, more than we could ever need in everywhere, in Zimbabwe, in Ghana, here, everywhere. There's just too much, and I think there needs to be, in terms of this cultural value system, because, I'm not a fashion person at all. I'm not in these kind of textile conversations, I'm in the theatre background, and until last year I was just buying at ASOS, and I wasn't thinking about it, at all. So I've got loads of crap myself, and I admit that, but I've tried to stop. This year I've not bought any clothes, and I never want to buy clothes again, to be honest, after being in Ghana, because I've got too many. I can see that. And then I think it's we need a revolution, because if fashion is just this expression of our society, I feel we're I don't know, it's easy to say, but it's this activism conversation actually around when are we going to wake up and say we need to stop, and that our kind of consumerism is out of hand, that capitalism is out of hand. We're kind of in this post-capitalist thing where actually now we all understand that growth is not good, and that growth doesn't help, and growth is a killer. We all know that now. We know that capitalism and capital cities need, we need to de-invest from this idea of just the capital and just putting all our resources into one thing. And I think there's an understanding of that, widely, actually. I think, because I work with a lot of teenagers, I think a lot of young people are understanding that idea that, okay, maybe this doesn't always work, and that was a kind of value system of the 80s and the 90s. But then I think we're struggling now, this generation of people, to understand what is our value system now and how can we create something new, because we're all just in this fallout of capitalism. That's how it feels, and this is all part of the fallout. I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but I kind of feel there does need to be some kind of revolutionary culture shift in terms of perception and value, and I don't know, it feels exciting that fashion, because that is such a youth movement, that could be part of that. It could be part of changing that value system.
I think the idea of value is interesting to think about. And one of the things that I found myself thinking about when we were conceptualizing Return to Sender is about the very intentional invisibility of labor around the textile supply chain. So if you think about the processes of making, and where the making is happening, you have a lot of manufacturing that's happening in Bangladesh, in India, in Morocco, and all of these processes and all of these makers are intentionally invisible, right? It's because the conditions are terrible, and a lot of these brands know that they can get away with many things in that part of the world that they wouldn't get away with in their part of the world. One of the things that people also talk about is that in Europe, there's very little manufacturing that's left. And most of the manufacturing that is left in Europe is the more premium manufacturing. So you hear about Gucci producing in Italy and everything that is associated with. And so when you think about the journey of the production of garments, where the raw materials are coming from, where they move to be produced, and then they are shipped to the global north, where they're purchased, and then the waste is then moved again to the global south. So the global south acts as the provider of raw materials and production labor, but also the provider of the labor of waste management. And I think that as we think about education, it's really important for us to think about how to make labor visible again. I think we find ourselves in this situation because so much of the labor and so much of the processes are intentionally invisible. So very few people, and everyone in this room is an outlier, but most people don't know what it takes to make a dress, right? A lot of people in this world have no idea what a cotton plant looks like, or a flax plant for that matter. And I think that that's how we find ourselves in this moment where we approach things, and clothing in particular, as so easily disposable. Because if you go into a store and a t-shirt is cheaper than a cup of coffee, it's really difficult to convince anyone that that piece of clothing is valuable. And so I think there's a strong case to be made about making processes visible again. There's a trend forecaster called Lee Edelcourt who once gave this quote that stuck with me ever since, and she said, "How is it that something that needs to be grown, harvested, spun, dyed, woven, stitched, packaged, shipped, how is that cheaper than a cup of coffee?" Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go to Varney first.
It's just a thought that came to me, while I visited one of the pieces of work across the road, and it's I can't remember what it's called, but it's the one with a house made of bale, and I just thought, with the shortage of houses these days, can we not somehow come together and devise means of building houses with this fabric?
Someone else said this yesterday.
It's not beyond our means to just think, who was it I was hearing here today who said, I think you said something about think it. I can't remember what the quote was exactly, but yeah, that's one. I have to say my contribution really is that I buy very little. My younger brother gives me my clothes. I buy my underwears, that's about it. And I really don't stop wearing them until they're falling apart. The one thing I have to say that goes very quickly are socks. They either the machine eats them or they just get stretched. But my shoes, I don't buy shoes. I haven't bought shoes for a long time. These ones I have, what my younger brother gave me. The other pair I have is about 10 years old, So, and I wear them. I use them daily, irrespective of what they are. I find it hard to throw away clothes. The few pieces that I have 2 suits. I have to, as a black man, Jamaican, you have to have a black suit so you can go to a funeral. Mm-hmm. That will serve other purposes as well. And I found recently, because I was told through an exhibition I have at the Biennial that I'm now a Jamaican gentleman, so I felt the need to have a blue suit, which is something other than the black one, so I have one. But really, we don't really need all that we have. The beauty in us is within us, and it's not what we wear on our sleeves, really. We don't need it, to be honest. You can pass your clothes down or up. You can pass them sideways, and, I don't see any real reason why people shouldn't be doing all of that, starting today right here.
Yeah.
But where does that frugal side come from?
It's just the way we were brought up. I remember when I was, I was doing something at the house building something, and my son came in and he looked at the shelf and he says, you know, that shelf used to be a table. You know, because you've reused the piece of wood, you don't throw it away. When we pass today, and it's not just fashion, really, when you look at the amount of material, the exhibition you've got across the road, what's going to happen to the steel when you finish? Is it going to be repurposed? When you look at the shop, they have an exhibition, and the whole place is carpeted. What happens to all that carpet? I'm talking about a place like the NEC in Birmingham. Mm-hmm. They carpet it for the car show. What happens to that carpet? What happens to all that wood? You find a great big dumper truck is that waiting for it outside. So it's not just fashion, it's how do we use material and how do we value material. And I think the most important thing is not how we value the material, it's how we value ourselves. Mm-hmm. And we feel we need to have these objects to make ourselves valuable. Mm. And I think it's much more than that.
Yeah. I remember having a quote from Nora Bateson who talks about the relationships between things and sense of there's not carbon in the atmosphere because we just put it there. It's carbon in the atmosphere because we love each other and we want to be loved. I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. That actually, it's all about how our relationships with each other. Can I go over to you there?
Thank you. I'm Ruth. I'm a lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University on the Fashion Design and Communication programme. So just responding to what Rose and Rachel and you were saying as well about education. So I brought a lot of my students around the exhibitions in Blackburn, and loads of them kind of unsurprisingly didn't know about the whole export of waste clothing to Africa. And yeah, they come from school and the subjects are so rigid. So Rose was talking about the disconnect between context and studio, which does exist on our programme. I'm constantly trying to get them to link the two. Well, and many of us are, but it sort of doesn't seem to happen somehow. And we don't have a textiles course either at LJMU anymore. We used to. So there's a real disconnect between the sort of, understanding of textiles and the processes and raw materials. They always get their yarns from like the same suppliers. It's just they don't really think about it. It'd be great to take them to Cantamanto and some of the other markets and just get them to, go to places like that for their raw materials. But yeah, I think that there's also a disconnect in school, really. Like there's a lack of education on British colonial history, but also the fact that that's interlinked with sustainability and climate change. They're not separate subjects, so that's a much bigger topic. But the problem is, with school education, like it's the same with sort of understanding of farming and linen production and cotton production. There's science in that and agriculture as well as textiles understanding. So yeah, it's kind of, I think, interdisciplinary sort of understanding is really important. So I'll just commenting on that. But it's really interesting also to hear about all the things that are happening that everyone's been talking about with all these really exciting projects in kind of Zimbabwe and Senegal and Ghana, because quite often the narrative is when people do hear about those negative impacts of the neo-colonial sort of processes that people in Africa get, being general here, but get presented as the passive victims. So there also needs to be that global, the global perspectives brought into Western education as well. So it's really important that we kind of de-center the West when looking at fashion, textiles, but education more broadly. I think like there's been stuff being doing like with the Africa exhibition at the V&A and things like that. There's a lot more kind of that's decentering the West, but I think there's a lot more that can be done. And I want to take my students to some of these countries. What I'm starting to do is do like collaborative work with India, because a lot of my research is based in India. So bringing the students closer to some of the makers, craft producers there. Thank you for hearing. It's really interesting to hear about everybody's work and stuff, so thanks.
I'm Emily, by the way. I work with BTB. I'm a guest curator of material memory in the Cathedral Crypt, but I'm also a recent graduate from the Royal College, where Kwame and I have a friend that Joyce, who works with you, is of Ghanaian origin, and and we've been really lucky to have had a really excellent education on this information throughout our course, and I can't tell you the impact it has had on the entire cohort that I was part of. Myself and Urus, who also graduated from there. I would say 50% of the people on our course don't make clothes anymore. They are making, sorry, I'm from a fashion MA, I should say. They don't make clothes anymore. They make solutions to these problems. And so actually the benefit of being educated on this within education is really prolific. I graduated from MMU and I did not know this. We were just straight in there, what designs, we need this many designs, this many twirls, this many outcomes. But actually, if you're fed this information from the get-go, it completely changes your creative practice, and that is so impactful. None of us had to travel to these countries to know this. We just had to have a guest speaker to sort of illustrate this information. But I would also say that, although that's fantastic, I'm really, really privileged to have gone and had that education, and we're talking in an echo chamber here of people who are creatives and understand this information, and actually this is a mass market problem. So how do we reach those people that aren't in these circles, that don't have this information, that don't have the sort of economics to not shop at Primark? Like, what is the solution there? That would be my question.
Thank you. Yeah, really excellent provocation. I know, did you want, oh no, sorry. Go to Mario.
So I'm Mario from Modern Textiles. I am a manufacturer, and we manufacture locally, relatively locally. We're just in Northern Ireland. I had so many answers for so many of the conversations that have been going on, but starting with the education, a big thing that I'm finding as an employer of weavers, of people to make, is that a lot of people coming out of textile, a lot of textile graduates are design graduates, so they're trained as designers, but they don't actually know how to make. So the first thing I have to do is train them actually how to make what they've been thinking about for the last 3-4 years, whatever their degree course is. So for me, that's a really important thing, but it doesn't need to just be a textile graduate that makes. It could be a mechanic. I mean, a lot of the looms that we use could also be of interest to somebody from a mechanics background. So it's really just maybe demystifying the production process and maybe making it a little bit more attractive almost as a career. I mean, nowadays, a lot of our manufacturing goes abroad, so it's sort of by bringing it back home and by introducing it to maybe a local community, it then can be brought back into our system. And I think that's something that I think adds value to the products that we make, to the things that we own, to the things that we wear, is knowing where it comes from. And you really, when you get a hands-on, like for example, if I make a blanket, that blanket has an added value to it, for me especially, but for people who know how it's made, they want to keep that blanket for a long time. They don't want to get rid of it. It becomes an heirloom. It becomes something that they carry on holding. Whereas if something is made elsewhere, you don't really know how it's made. It's more throwaway. And I think that's, as a manufacturer, that's an added value that I think is valuable. Basically, that's all I had to say.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Tom.
Yeah. I mean, there's obviously a lot of talk about sort of fast fashion, and while that is a problem, even if we didn't have fast fashion, we've still got there's 8 billion of us all have clothes. So there's a problem sort of outside of fast fashion as well of what eventually becomes of these garments. Cotton can't be recycled infinitely. We can sort of upcycle it and take the material and then reform it, but eventually it will have to go somewhere. Even if we're using it as a painter's cloth or using it to clean, eventually that textile has to go somewhere. And I think both in terms of, we've talked about sort of the manufacture of it, so not having blends, because you're mixing a biological cycle with a technical cycle. And so if anyone's read Cradle to Cradle, which is a brilliant book, I recommend it to everybody, but it's about the sort of idea of how can these cycles be infinitely recyclable, and that's keeping them separate. So we can recycle a lot of metals infinitely, a lot of plastics infinitely, but and same with textiles. If they're from a biological source, we could recycle them infinitely in terms of giving them back to the world and finding ways to do that that sort of doesn't dump it all in one place, and sort of the biological processes that have to go in place to handle that amount of material. But throughout the cycle, we can't then mix that. So even if we've not blended it initially, we can't sort of mix that textile in later uses to a sort of technical stream of plastics or metal or enamel or something like that.
Yeah, so it's really important, again, to be thinking from the beginning about those materials and kind of how they flow through the system.
Yeah, the ultimate aim is like eventually, if we reuse these textiles and materials, eventually they're going to have to become waste. They just will. They're not going to be able to use in those contexts forever. Even if they go into building a house, eventually that house is going to come down. So it's really interesting in terms of well, can we use these fibres in building materials? There's people are 3D printing cob houses now, kind of thing, and that can that's actually a biological cycle. And we can obviously, even on the sort of technical cycle, we've got to find ways to make concrete infinitely recyclable metals, plastics, but the key thing is don't mix them.
Which again comes back to the kind of question around soil. Would you like to, Ian?
Hi, my name's Leonie. I'm a weaver from Birmingham. I actually studied at MMU. I did textiles in practice, and I guess I'm just kind of picking up on what a lot of people are saying, that when I was studying weaving in particular, like Rose said, we just kind of grabbed the yarn off the shelf and
with Leslie.
Yeah, with Leslie, and I actually picked up on weaving with West Indian Sea Island cotton, and I have quite a bit of it. I was donated some by an Italian fabric company called Albini, and they actually have 100% exclusivity over the cotton grown in Barbados and Jamaica. And so I guess me now in my practice, I'm thinking how I can be very careful with the cotton that I have, because once I run out of that, how do I get access to that? And I don't want to be, very wasteful in my practice. I still want to kind of enforce that sustainability, but also tell this story of, the history and the ties with West Indian Sea Island cotton. I think it's really important, and I think it's just that balance of knowing that cotton can be, the way we use it is very wasteful, but it's really important to kind of tell that story and kind of push these narratives through our textiles. And then how do we use those textiles? Is it through art? Or is it through fashion? Because then you kind of have that whole conversation about our fashion being wasted and stuff like that. So I think there's a lot to kind of think about, especially with my practice. And that was just my input.
Thank you. Okay, would you like to come in?
Yeah. Hi. This was a response to a few earlier things that were said. But a lot of the different conversations have made me think of this concept of waste-led design, which I learned about from this really interesting website, the Slow Factory. I'm not sure if anyone's heard of it. It's a really good online resource for education around fashion, but not just fashion. It takes in a lot of wider context kind of educational topics. But I think, the idea of waste-led design, where as the designer of a new object, you think about what will happen to this object when it eventually gets thrown away, and factor that into, therefore, your materials choices and all that kind of thing. And obviously the mixture of different materials within one fabric is a big problem. I was at a different conference, a Textile Institute conference, and there was a lot of talk about people who are trying to invent machinery for textile recycling and how difficult that is because of blended fabrics. And that's a sort of big problem. And I think one of the things that really drew me to growing my own textiles and using flax is because if it's a natural fiber, it's a soil to soil cycle. So you can grow things from the soil, use them, and then because they've not had any chemicals, and obviously I'd be also intending to use natural dyes, it can then be composted when it eventually reaches the end of its useful life, rather than going to landfill. That was just some of my thoughts. Oh, and that was the other thing, was I feel this, something someone mentioned this morning about extended producer responsibility, which I think is some legislation that's already been brought in France. I'm not sure if it's been brought in anywhere else, where they're trying to make companies who produce things to be responsible for what happens to that product when it gets thrown away. So it's kind of similar to waste-led design, but it's like legislation around that to try and hold like massive companies responsible for what happens to their waste products, rather than just being able to throw things away and like stop thinking about them once they go in the bin.
Yeah, really important piece of policy. I'm going to go to Hannah and then to you.
Yeah, it actually links to that. I was going to mention the extended producer responsibility came out this year in July, and it's being discussed by the EU Commission. At the moment, I think it's France and Netherlands, and it essentially is looking at concepts around circular economy, but it's basically putting the responsibility back on the producers, back on the big brands. So they don't, we've been speaking about this a lot recently, but it's not about big brands just having an opportunity to change, but it's an obligation. Like, they will have to take responsibility for the end of life of their garments. However, I think an interesting point is it needs to go beyond just this extended producer responsibility as it is to a really holistic view of their responsibility can't just be, recycling, giving to charity. It has to move beyond that. It needs to be, how can we take responsibility for the end of the life of the garments, where they were produced, where they were made, where they were sold, in EU countries. So it's a good step in the right direction, but I think as consumers and citizens, we need to put pressure for these types of legislations and these types of big changes. So brands will be forced to take more responsibility. Because, as we've said, like, this is an echo chamber here. I think we're all on the same page. We all want change. So I think it's thinking about how can we spread this kind of movement and sentiment.
Thank you. I'll go to you here and then to Lucille. Okay, sorry.
So I want to continue what Hannah said, I think we have to think in life cycles and in circles, basically. First of all, we, as a designer, we need to think about what happens during the end of cycle, after the user phase of that garment. And I think there are two things, when it comes to teaching, I think specifically teaching in textiles, it's important for the students to have this kind of curriculum where they need to learn about the materials, and they should be having a multi-level perspective to everything, that what would be the result of, like, yes, you're producing it, but what would be the byproducts and what would be the effects of this production. So we need to think not in, like, only have one perspective of this would be the product. There should be a multi-level perspective, and I think at Carnegie Mellon, the university, basically, this is the research that's taking place, and we need to think in terms of systems, because systems thinking is important, because one problem is connected to the other. So I think it's during the first years, or when you're starting to study textiles, you need to think about in terms of materials and systems thinking before producing something. So that should be important when it comes to the curriculum of fashion and textiles, which a lot of designers aren't familiar with, and that becomes the problem, because they just want to produce more clothes, and if you're not familiar with what's going inside and what's happening in the production space, then I don't think it makes sense to suddenly expect people to think while they are graduating or after they have graduated to think in these systems. So that's what
it has to be kind of all the way through. Yeah. Is it okay, Mitch, if I go to Lucille first and then to you?
There's this course that just needs to stop, and that's colour trends. One of my masters is in textile design, sustainable textile design it was supposed to be, and I was criticised because I didn't attend the colour trends workshop. And I said, I'm a natural dyer. Nature will provide the colour trends. But it's more than that. In certain communities, cultures, colour has meaning. And maybe in the UK, we need to assign meaning to colour so that whether the colour trend says it's orange this season or whatever, it doesn't matter to us because we have a relationship with certain colours. So I think that course needs to go substituted. The other thing is labelling. The exhibitions this year in the Textile Biennial fantastic. I had a couple of questions about this cotton cloth that was woven. It's woven in the Textile Museum here. I understand that those weaving mills, they keep them going by sort of doing maybe a occasional weaving. And I bought a metre of the cloth because I like to buy cloth that people make. But I asked where the cotton came from. They didn't know. The community clothing project, I understand that they want to bring back production to the UK. But afterwards I thought, those panties look really interesting, made in Wales. I like that idea. I just want to check where the material comes from because that's important to me. And now I am still waiting for them to answer that question. So I think we really need to be transparent about our materials. Think about the materials, tell the consumer about the materials. There's a project in the States, I think it's called Remake. They're trying to make you form a relationship with who makes your clothing. There were some interesting videos on jeans in Haiti, because I didn't even know that jeans were made in Haiti. And you start to form a relationship with the people who make them, their dreams and their aspirations. I don't know if it changes behaviour, but I do know that when I went to Nigeria, I bought some vintage cloth, and it really pleased me that I had a relationship with the maker. There was cloth that had the maker's name. Those cloths are super special, and I will continue using those cloths until they go back to the earth. But I don't agree with you that you can't find an additional function, because I think, I don't know, maybe coming from a Jamaican background, similar, you carry on using it, you fashion something else, and then it ends up in a cushion, it ends up stuffing, and then finally maybe it's mixed and thrown off in the compost.
Absolutely, definitely as many uses as we can between it sort of that, and in terms of cradle to cradle, it's a case of eventually it will go back to the earth, and the processes that the multiple uses that we use afterwards, just making sure that it's still in a state where the earth will accept it.
Yes, most definitely, that we haven't contaminated our processes. And one of the maybe the second most polluting things is synthetic colour. So we have to question our relationship to synthetic colour, don't we? Because that's going back in the earth. Do we really need to have synthetic colour? I mean, it's going to change, it's a real shift, but we really have to think about whether we're going to continue doing that.
Thank you. Okay, and then to
thank you. Oh, okay. Hi, my name is Michelle Bondizio. I'm helping edit Creative Lancashire. I don't have a textile background, but I am trying to be a conscious consumer. And I have an observation and a couple of questions relating to what Tom was talking about and what we were talking about at the beginning about regenerative agriculture. And we've talked a lot about linen and cotton and flax, and I understand there's a very strong historical connection to the UK and the mills and so on. And there are current issues that we need to be solving around how these are produced and how they're sold and all of the issues that have been discussed today. But this is also called Textile Futures and this talk, and we need to be thinking about what are we going to be doing in the future and these new fabrics and textiles and the plants that potentially we may be using that don't just produce textiles, but also produce those building materials that you were talking about, that produce food, that produce all the other things, and that can be put back into the soil to make the soil better so we can produce more better. And hemp is a very fast-growing, very resilient plant. I haven't heard anybody talking about hemp today, and I'm interested to know why that hasn't been introduced into the conversation. Is it because it's difficult to grow in this environment? Is it because of its illegal cousin that makes it really hard to access? So I'm interested to know, that's a potential future solution for us.
Okay. Oh, you can fight between yourselves.
So you've touched a nerve there. I'm going to over-respond to your statement, so I apologize. So I think there's a very dangerous discourse around what is called future textiles, because and actually this is a fascinating topic. Talking about education, I have a background in philosophy of science. I'm really interested in these things, and I think we come from a world which is obsessed with something called science, and we think the future is going to be solved by science. And I think we have this vision of someone in a lab is going to come up with a mad thing which is going to solve everyone's problems. And I think that's a very dangerous way of thinking. I think actually we've lived in this place for a long time. And I think this comes back to a lot of what people have been saying about natural dyes, about, we know how to live on this planet. We don't need crazy inventions. So I would say the future is actually not the past, but it's rediscovering the past in a better way. So I think beware of discourses around, we are going to use seaweed to create, we are going to use, because if you can produce 10 centimeters in a highly controlled environment in a laboratory, that's not a scalable solution to a global problem. So I think here we are discussing the future, first point. Second, on hemp. So hemp is a very trendy fiber at the moment in this space. Hemp and flax are actually very, very similar in their properties. Flax makes a superior textile, which is why I think flax tends to be, is more grown. Hemp is, I think, part of the solution. Again, I feel in the current discourse, it's being presented as a very trendy, popular fiber, mainly because of its connection to cannabis, I think. But it's definitely, it's in this space, basically. So it's not, in that sense, it's not a magic, it's also not a magical solution. But in an industry, in a world where flax can be processed, hemp can be processed as well in a very similar way, so it's also part of that.
Just to pick up your question about hemp, well, hemp was if you look at textile history, hemp was the fibre of choice even before cotton, and then cotton came along and then hemp went out of fashion. So hemp has always been in the system of cloth, but it just went out of fashion because cotton then became much more profitable, and so it became the thing that was there. And if we look at fibres today, one of the newest ones on the block is banana fibre. But I was in Pitt Rivers recently and found in there a sample of plantain fibre, a crochet product made out of plantain fibre in 1855. So using banana fibre, plantain fibre isn't anything new. It's just that we have to look in the archive to see what was done before. And if we think about there's a fibre called Pinatex using pineapple. So it's not the textile futures that we're talking about, textile that's already been done before. People are just reinventing the wheel. They've just found a way to make it profitable, and that's why it becomes the thing. But it's not that it's not been done before. And we then have to look at indigenous knowledge systems, which bring me back to Sunny's talking about home science being used, where boys and girls learn about the science of food or learn about the science of textiles and making. And that's within the kind of African culture or within Afro-Caribbean culture, that's a throwback to the colonial education system. But if we look at what we've done here, we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater, we've taken out the home economics and science, and we've kind of disengendered kind of the textiles bit. And if you look at the figures for textiles as done by the population, it's 90, I think the last figure I looked at was 90% female that were being educated in the textile sphere. That has issues about who actually understands what's happening within the sustainability sphere, how we're educating the future populations. And when I was doing, this is kind of a thing that I do in my class, I said, well, if you've got a shirt, how many of you know how to put a button back on your shirt? And how many of you would go to the dry cleaners and pay £5 to get somebody to put a button on for you? And 90% of the class say they would pay somebody to go and put the button on for them. So this notion of how we think about education systems, and this notion of if you understand how to do something, it re-engages or makes you think about the enterprise systems that you can set up. But also this notion that when a dominant culture has been in your culture, the indigenous systems go underground, and then at another time they re-rise again. So I think at this time we're seeing this re-rising of the indigenous knowledge systems that are then kind of saying, actually, we know how to mix the two together. And so you get in these hybrid cultures now coming up within these systems, and they are actually saying, we can do this and we can change the systems that were there before, and we know how to reuse materials in a different way.
Thank you. Over to Thierry.
Thinking about the future for me is, the future is too far, but it's already now because, you know, I think in many countries in Africa, when you have one clothes and it's nice clothes, and when it's damaged, you have to repair. So we have to think about this system for the future. I don't think we're going to invent something like new for the textile in the future because, like she said, we like in Benin we are experimenting now with pineapple leaf and also a banana leaf. But this all exists. I have from my mother like something with the banana leaf, but it's stronger than like the fiber of cotton. So I don't know why we don't develop this thing, and we produce. I have also from cotton from my father with like head, but it's already like 40 years, but it's still like new. But I don't know if we're going to invent another thing. We have to think about how to make, good, and how to use a good way what we buy. So.
Thank you. I'm going to re-engage with those
with
those aspects. Okay, over to Jason, and then we're going to start thinking about how we kind of pull this in.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I agree about the socks because I've been using the same socks about 15 years. Do you want to just say that? Wow, I'm Jason Stockton. I'm a leather worker, Diamond Doll Leather Workshop. So I know you're not spoke about leather specifically, but it's interesting. Hello, about the future textiles and the look at where it's going, because I feel as a maker, I'm always looking over my shoulder. I've been doing what I've been doing for about 12 to 15 years, and these future textiles, the name which you've mentioned some, Rose, you've just mentioned some, so Pinitex, mycelium, which is mushroom, fish scales, mango material, fruit-based, plant-based materials, which have characteristics of leather. The problem is that they're, from looking, it's quite expensive to produce, and they're not as sustainable as the book says it is. They don't last as long. I'm from a world where quality over quantity, any leathers that I use for my students, and I teach most of the time, I almost go to the core foundation of how leather is produced from a tannery. It's a waste product from the meat industry. I don't use any leathers that have got chemicals in, and there's good reasons why. And I feel that strong foundation is to start from there, that, for a fashion course, they almost need to not even learn about fashion first thing. They need to learn about the materials they'll be using and how it's created. I think that's fundamentally important. And as a maker, I think I'm thinking about that all the time. It's something I didn't even think about before. I just thought, buy leather from a tannery or a leather supplier. Yeah. I just do what I do and I teach my students. But it's really questioning everything. Offcuts, waste, where is it going? Yeah. How can I reuse that? Can I make cat collars and give it to some charities to make some money? I'm thinking like that all the time, and I'm passing it on to my students to be thinking like that. And it's so frustrating. Again, I know Sunny's not here, just saying about the bales and the waste. It makes me so angry. I know he mentioned about the trade agreements or potential trade agreements to be taken away from Africa if they don't continue to continue to receive this waste. I'm looking at America as America, and excuse my French, as a bit of a school bully, if that's the case. And what I'm learned, and being black in Jamaica and being from a school where it was 983 white kids, and I was a little black kid there, I'll let you do the science with that, is that bullies, when there's a number, you stand up against bullies and there's a number behind it, they start to listen. And the and bullies like America are saying they're going to pull trade agreements away if you don't continue to receive our rubbish. It's a disgrace of epic proportion. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, I want Africa to say no, because as a country, as an individual me, I'll stand behind them. And I think other countries will do the same thing. So no, we're not let you stand and just take that. We'll shout as loud as we can and raise awareness, whether it's social media, on TV, say, look, this is what America wants to do, and we're not, and they're going to fully create agreements because we want to do the right thing. And I think that is just a disgrace if that is the case. I've never heard it before. I had something similar from Gus Casely-Hayford, who spoke a couple of weeks back. Similar kind of scenario. Yeah. And it's like, I'm almost like, I'm so angry about it because how come we can't do anything? It's almost like you need to start from the top down. We're looking at the moment from the bottom up. And we know how changes don't always happen like that. We're going through a country right now that's happening right now. We're going through it now. So I think, again, we need to be, look at how we have these relationships and really try and collaborate to get together and say, look, no, enough's enough. That's it, sorry.
Thank you. And that is the perfect rallying cry for us thinking now. I know a few people here have already said, like, we are the people who are talking about this all the time and thinking about it all the time. How do we kind of get it out to the wider public? And that's obviously what the Biennial is doing, is really bringing in these experiences and helping people to think about things differently. But I'd like to we've got around half an hour now, so I'd like to take a couple of minutes for people to think kind of on their own, but also maybe with the people next to them. If we are thinking about what is this kind of rallying cry, what is, Laurie said earlier, almost the idea of a manifesto. What are the things that we want to be putting out there that can support all of our work, but also the work of the Biennial going forward? What would those things be? So I'm going to invite you to take a couple of minutes with, either you can do it yourself or with the person or people next to you, to say what are the 1, 2, 3 things that you would say we need to be sending this message in our work and in what we're doing collectively. So I'm going to invite you to do that for a few minutes now, and then we'll invite people to share back. But first of all, I'm being asked to invite Yasheen to give us a kind of final closing point before we move into that space.
I'm just curious to know what you guys think about the role that artificial intelligence could play in helping us create the textile of the future. That's the question that I have for all of you. What do you guys think about the role that artificial intelligence could play?
A big question. What is the role of AI? I wonder if... I feel like we could open up into a huge discussion here around that. So I might say, unless anyone's got a very succinct answer to that, maybe that's something we kind of throw out for people to be thinking about as they're kind of reflecting on things. Does anyone want to say, can you keep it
very quick? Yeah.
Tight?
AI has I think it has enormous possibilities and obviously some dangers as well. I think I'm a proponent of sort of universal basic income. So although AI and mechanization will inevitably take a lot of jobs, it comes back to textiles. One of my favorite little facts is that we get the word sabotage from the word sabot, which is a French wooden clog, and that was chucked into jacquard looms when they were in France, when they invented, because a lot of loomers lost their jobs. I think we've got, because of that process of mechanization, we've got so much more in terms of comfortable living. So I'm not opposed to it. I think it's just with AI and the sort of coming wave, it's too many industries at once. We've never had this sort of so broad, and sort of our political systems aren't set up to deal with that. So I think that's sort of the problem. I think that it will affect all industries. It's just a case of we need to make sure that everyone's looked after, because we're going to have so much value created in that we need to then redistribute that to the people.
To the point that was made earlier that people are just buying stuff to wear once on TikTok, it seems, and my son, all he wants, and he's 12, all he wants is digital skins for his avatars. He doesn't want any material stuff. We're not very far away, excuse me, from people just reskinning themselves for TikTok and Instagram using AI, and that, to me, is like I don't like this stuff, but it's a positive if it's going to save the dumping and trashing of stuff. I think bring it on in terms of digital skins. So something in that with AI.
Great. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to invite you all to turn to the person next to you, a couple of people next to you, and reflect on what are the 1, 2, or 3 things, if this was a manifesto, this is a thing, the intentions coming from this group in the room out into the world, what will they be? And then, I know it's a big ask, but pick something that seems top of the most pertinent from today's discussions, and then we're going to ask you to briefly kind of share that back before we wrap up for this afternoon. So turn to the person next to you and reflect on what you've been thinking about. Okay, we're going to come back together. I know there's so much to talk about, and we could have this conversation for the rest of the afternoon, but I'm going to get you to come back. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Right, what I'm going to ask you to do, this is going to have to be fairly rapid fire, but I'm going to pass around the mic and share one, possibly two things, very succinctly, that you think are the things that we should be, the intentions that we should be leaving with and that we should be focusing on as part of this space. And really particularly invite anyone who hasn't spoken yet, to share from their group. So we're not going to ask everyone, but just from the kind of pairs who would like to kind of reflect a couple of things. So I'm going to start with Rosie, who's going to model very well, very succinct.
I'll try, no pressure. So the idea which kind of leapt out to me was kind of partly based on what Tom was saying about make spaces and thinking about the idea of having like global knowledge exchange but local produce exchange. So rather than like growing or extruding like fabric in one country and processing it and weaving it and then posting it somewhere else to be sewn and posting it somewhere else to be made and then it goes somewhere else to be, go into landfill, that could all happen in like a more local area. So using whatever local fiber and local dye is like grows best in your particular environment, but then not seeing the hyper-localism as kind of just harking back to history, but also still wanting to have this kind of like global knowledge exchange and exchange of ideas and kind of like open source kind of programming and hardware design. So we've been working with people to design the machines internationally and like sharing the machine designs online. So yeah, that's my idea, I guess.
Thank you. Go over to Nick there.
No more £1 t-shirts.
Great.
Beware of the language. This morning we're talking about upcycling, and I thought, who came up with that term? And I don't think it was someone from sub-Saharan Africa. So thinking about language, and hopefully we won't be using words which actually feel quite empty in reality.
Thank you. Sunny, did you?
I feel we've put a huge burden onto BTB. I don't know where they are, but we spoke about the need to address international economic systems.
No pressure.
And picking up on a point that this woman made over here around systems thinking and the fact that we've been talking a lot about textiles and agriculture, but in fact we need to also address our notions of what is scalable and what growth means, and that it's all intertwined.
Thank you.
We discussed care, visibility, and making sure everyone is always at the table for these conversations, and everyone's included.
Jeremy, did you want to?
Yeah.
No pressure, but
before I have a microphone. Two things. Two things. One, to support community-led solutions for the people that are dealing with our waste, because often they have the best answers, and to really support those and give visibility. And the second is we have a colossal problem with overproduction, and to even begin to meet that problem, we have to explore ways of volume reduction. 40% volume reduction is a figure that's been put out there by an activist group that I collaborate with, and it needs to be mandatory for fashion brands to publish their volume, the production that they produce, the volume that they produce every year, because currently it's completely obscure. On Monday, I will actually be going in my Out Monster suit to Boohoo and Next and Adidas and George and Primark. and with a letter to ask them to do exactly that. So let's see.
Great, thank you.
We were discussing indigenous thinking and kind of going back to that as designers moving forward, and not thinking so much about trends and fast fashion, really kind of focusing on that slow fashion and what we can do to kind of aid this conversation that we've been having today.
I'm afraid you've been left with it, don't I?
I think we mentioned something along the lines of, if we're going to be radical in our approach, it would be let's just stop making stuff. And what we mean by let's stop making stuff is we already have so much that's already made. Maybe we could consider restructuring our fashion system to create a solution around the problem that we have created. And what we meant is, for example, we have this stuff. We go through the bales. We separate them in terms of category, cotton, linen, color category. We have a team that deconstructs it. Then we actually train students when they come into institutions how to create new products around product that's already available or resources that's already available. So it's literally, in a sense, breaking down the fashion system and reconstructing it to solve this issue that we've created for ourselves, rather than continually trying to grow new cotton, grow new linen, spin new materials. Maybe when we're creating our technologies, we think of, okay, how can we spin this stuff? You know what I mean? Like, how can we create technologies that resolve this problem that we have created? And I think sometimes when people often say about, we want to bring about a change, we often feel like, oh, so does that mean that I can no longer be creative? Does that mean that I no longer have a livelihood? But we're saying, no, that can continue. It's the way we think and the way in which we function that needs to be transformed in order to create a solution for ourselves. So, yeah. Did I forget anything? Okay, great.
Thank you.
We kind of spoke about kind of quite a few things, but we picked up on three main kind of notions, and the first one I think that really stood out to me through kind of what everyone's been saying today is value, and what has value and what do we put value on, and I think that ties into kind of understanding where the raw material comes from and what that raw material is, whether it's cotton, whether it's flax, hemp, wool, silk, and where do these fibres come from? How can we produce them? How can we use them kind of sustainably, ethically, considerately? I'm a lecturer at the University of Bolton, so it's been interesting to hear a couple of other lecturers speaking today, thinking about what lots of people have said can factor into kind of my teaching and programme development and what we already do. So we do talk a lot about a lot of the issues. We're kind of quite conscious about talking about this within education, within our students, but we were saying actually it shouldn't just sit within that university kind of level of academia, because then it becomes really hierarchical and it's only people who go to university are talking about it at a certain level, and actually these topics and subjects can be embedded, or these topics and discussions can be embedded across all subjects, so from geography to history to science to engineering, technology, and then it becomes more accessible to everyone, and people hopefully become more aware of that kind of that wider issue, so then become more aware of the value that we might place onto different products. So yeah, was there anything else?
Yeah, I think that was it. Thank you.
Is this on? Yes, it is. We talk very much about how it's made such a big difference to ourselves through being active volunteers in the Homegrown Homespun project and growing the flax, and actually getting really involved, finding out what was involved and actually really thinking about that. And that led us to talk about education and how important practical education is. And that's very missing, I think, in a lot of schools today, in that people aren't doing those sort of projects. But that's what really made the difference to us, was the whole thing about getting involved and getting communities involved in that sort of very basic level of textile production, just to aid understanding. We also talked about, with Mario, about the importance of producing very beautiful things that you would want to keep for a very long time as well.
Someone talked about scalability before and thinking about what can be scalable, but if it can't, and Jason used the example of farms in Scotland working together to bring all their hides, leather hides, to to have a market for them, because 1 or 2 was not enough to meet market needs. So yeah, thinking about building relationships across small scale producers. Was there anything else we talked about? Education, made to order, yeah, so less is more, and reducing production and making on a smaller scale based on what people need and want, rather than overproducing and having waste, and yeah, so minimising waste.
There's a great example of a company called Painter, which are on, it's Payter, where they make jackets made to order like 4 seasons, 4 times a year, and they build a social media following around it. Then they basically sell out every season. I say season sensitive because I don't believe in seasons, but there you go. But it works. The business model works. So it's less is more, quality than quantity, zero waste, etc., etc. Yeah.
Okay. We touched on quite a few things, but what stood out, I guess, was how we are able to draw a line between academia and education, because most often we like to think that education is like in a certain structure, like you need to go into like a certain building to be informed about certain things. So like day school, college, university, whatever. And I was pointing to the fact that almost everything that I know about fashion, came from my home. My mom just told me and taught me everything that I know now. And then fast forward, I'm receiving emails from CSM, emails from RCA to speak about whatever that I know, from my mom and Kantamanto, like women from Kantamanto and all of that. So education, I think, is, in my opinion, like more superior than what we say academia is. Because really, academia also comes from, what people have learned by themselves, and it becomes like a whole book, and then it becomes a whole course, it becomes a whole university, so it's like the very basic things are, to me, like the most important things that we really, really, really need to consider. Because at the end of the day, whatever that we know, whatever complex things that we know, should come back to how it's affecting us, directly, like this body of ours. How is it benefiting us as people, and the next person? So it's very important to like kind of see the line between these two things. Yeah. And I think we also touched on AI and technology and
just a few small topics.
Yeah, a few small topics. So I think what we mentioned is that technology or AI is almost nothing if there isn't. It only exists because of us. And then if we don't trigger it, nothing happens. And so it's what we input. And I think someone mentioned that. So it's also important, as much as technology and AI is important, it's very critical that we are always engaging and attaching our emotional intelligence to bring something that's beneficial to us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and likewise in terms of that sort of decoupling between academia and education and the ownership of that word. Like, I got a lot more from third spaces than I did from my university degree. Going to maker spaces at the weekend and sort of valuing, those spaces and international collaboration and just learning from each other online as well and from the home and family and friends as well.
Thank you. Okay, our last couple of reflections from.
Me too. I think some of the key things we brought out was like understanding your cultural background and how bringing your I call it the cloth stories into being and using your voice understanding the value systems within your space, bring important stories in, and this notion of indigenous knowledge and that intergenerational exchange is really important, but also building communities of practice and community spaces where that knowledge can take place, where that knowledge exchange can take place, but also the value of activism and as a source of change in raising the voice. How do we address education systems and how can education systems change? But most importantly, we've been in various art installations, and how can art continue to be a voice of change to discuss the issues? Because art, for me, is a thing that can make change happen, and we wouldn't be here having this discussion if it wasn't for art. So art has a place to raise voice, to raise change, to raise discussion. So how can art continue to be this thing that can talk about activism and change within such a thing of importance such as this?
Thank you. Thank you so much for all your contributions this afternoon. I feel like my brain is frantically trying to pull all these different threads together. And I think that's the amazing thing about textiles. There's so many metaphors that you can use. But we were thinking about how we move this into intentions. I think everyone here is trying to do that in their own practice, in their own parts of the world, in their own work. But it's also amazing to have this space where we can think about that together. And I think we've covered some really interesting ideas around how we can bring that through, the importance of actually experience, whether that's having the opportunity to go and see where things are being made or being dealt with as waste, or whether that's hearing from people's experiences who have had that, how we can transmit those things, how we can make visible the invisible processes, both from the the very beginning of the seed in the ground and the soil, and how we can make visible those processes all the way through the supply chain of textiles and fashion to how it's being wasted, what is happening in those communities and those people, showing people as a way of helping them to think differently about their own consumption, has obviously come out incredibly strongly. And through that education, both the formal spaces, but also the informal spaces of how we learn from our families, from one another, from our communities, and the value that's to be placed on creating and nurturing those spaces so that everyone can have access to this knowledge and this information, I think are some of the key things that have come together. But obviously there's been such a rich conversation and so many things to bring together. So I'm going to go full circle and close from another quote from Sophie Tannhauser from her book Worn. And she says, "When you watch a spider spin a web, it appears for a time to be walking over air. How does it get from point to point? How does it travel the distance between two firm holds when there is nothing connecting them? It makes the bridge as it goes, the threads it produces, creating that bridge. The thread itself is what provides the safe passage between the 2 points over an intraversible distance." And I think that's what we're seeing today, all these threads that people are weaving in their own spaces, which can seem very small or very part of a much bigger system, but together really is creating this shift across this bridge. And we're all thinking about the actions that we can take forward and keep developing to get from the point that we are into the future that we've all been talking about we're wanting to see today. So thank you so much for all your contributions, and particularly for our guests who have come so far to talk to us today. And we've really enjoyed having you from all over, locally and other parts of the UK and much further afield too. So thank you so much, and thank you particularly to the British Council for their support of that programme. Is there anything you'd like to add, Laurie, at the end?
Am I on? No.
Don't know.
I'd just like to add thank you to you, Josie, for chairing. And thank you so much for coming, everyone, and particularly everybody. I said to Thierry, Danai, Yassine, Sunny, who's just gone out, and Kwamina. Oh, he's back. You're like a little bloody...
He keeps disappearing.
Jack in a box. And so thank you for coming so far and enriching us so much with your experience. I think it's added a whole other dimension to our thinking, and we've got a lot to think about for 2025 and a lot to do. And I'm already knackered. Thank you so much, everybody, and thanks for everybody who's participated. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.